They didn't just fight in the snow. They were left there. Long after the rifles went silent and the polar bears came home, a haunting truth remained buried beneath the frozen soil of northern Russia. American sons, farm boys, factory workers, buried beneath the frozen soil of northern Russia. American sons, farm boys, Russia. American sons, farm boys, factory workers. Young men who had worn the uniform of the United States were still lying in remote graves scattered across forests, rivers, and forgotten battlefields. For most Americans, the polar bear expedition of 1918 to 1919 faded into the background of history. But for the men who survived it, and the families who never got a final goodbye, it never ended. Because war doesn't truly end when the last shot is fired. Sometimes it ends when the last soldier comes home. And in 1929, 10 years after the expedition withdrew, America made a decision that still speaks to national character: to go back for the fallen. To understand why that mission mattered, you have to feel what it meant to be a polar bear in the first place. These soldiers had been sent to a distant Arctic port, far from the public eye, fighting in a civil war most Americans could barely explain. In the brutal winter of 1918 to 1919, they endured deep snow, extreme cold, confusion about the mission, and hard fighting along remote fronts like the Dvina and the Vaga rivers. Men were killed in battles that rarely appeared in newspapers. Others died of disease, accidents, and exposure. And when the withdrawal finally came, the evacuation was not clean. The Arctic landscape and the chaos of war meant that not every body could be recovered. Some were buried in makeshift graves. Some were left where they fell. Many were marked with improvised identifiers that time and weather would erase. These weren't the grand cemeteries of Europe. These were isolated patches of ground in villages that barely existed on maps. Back in the United States, life moved on. The country entered the roaring 20s, and the memory of Russia of Arkhangelsk, Shenkursk, the frozen blockhouses and midnight marsh slipped away. But the veterans did not forget. They carried those memories like scars. They met each other, wrote letters, and gathered in reunions. And out of that brotherhood came something rare, a determination not just to remember the dead, but to bring them home. That determination became a mission, and that mission became a promise spoken sometimes out loud, sometimes only in the private language of men who have buried friends in the snow. A promise that said, "We will not leave you behind." In 1922, the veterans formed an organization with a simple name and an enormous purpose: the Polar Bear Association. Officially, it existed to preserve comradeship and keep the history alive. But beneath that, there was a deeper goal, one that every veteran understood instantly. The dead were still in Russia, and in America, the families still waited for closure. Some parents had received telegrams that said missing. Some wives never received a body, never had a grave to visit, never had the dignity of a funeral. The war had taken enough. The least a nation could do was return its sons to American soil. But going back wasn't simple. This wasn't 1919 anymore. Russia had become Soviet Russia, and diplomatic ties were a mess. Getting permission was slow, political, and painful. Years passed. Veterans grew older. Parents died never knowing where their sons were buried. Yet the pressure never stopped. The polar bears kept pushing. They lobbied. They wrote. They asked politicians to do something that would not benefit an election cycle, but would mean everything to families. And after a decade of waiting, America finally received approval for what would become one of the most extraordinary recovery missions in U.S. military memory. In the summer of 1929, a small team crossed the Atlantic and entered the same region where their comrades had fought and died. This wasn't a combat mission. It was something harder in a different way. A journey into old battlefields and abandoned cemeteries, into villages where time had moved on, into a land with new rulers and new rules. They carried old maps, faded notes, and the memory of where men had fallen. They walked through dense forests and swampy ground, searched along rivers, and relied on locals who remembered fragment stories of fighting, of burials, of bodies carried away by retreating troops. They weren't looking for treasure. They were looking for bones, dog tags, buttons, pieces of uniform, anything that could say with certainty, "This is him. This is our boy." Imagine the emotional weight of that work. Every grave they opened was a confrontation with the past. Every rusted tag was a name resurrected. But the conditions were brutal. Time had done what time always does. It destroys clarity. 10 years of neglect, weather, animals, and decay had erased much of what the men originally left behind. In many places, identification tags had corroded. Uniforms had disintegrated. The earth gave up little. Recovery became a test of patience and discipline. They had to treat human remains with dignity while working under difficult conditions, often far from comfort, far from modern equipment. They cleaned bones. They cataloged items. They made careful decisions, knowing that a mistake would mean sending the wrong remains to the wrong family, an unthinkable dishonor. And yet, they succeeded. Over the course of 2 months, the team located and recovered dozens of remains, 86 American soldiers in total. Some of those were reburied in American cemeteries in Europe, some were sent to families, and many were transported to Michigan, where the polar bear story lived strongest because so many of the men had come from there. Think about what that meant in real human terms. After 10 years, the country could finally say, "We found him." After 10 years, a family could finally have a grave. After 10 years, a mother could finally place flowers on a stone and speak to her son with something like peace. When the remains returned to the United States, the moment was solemn and unforgettable. Flag-draped caskets arrived in New Jersey and were met with dignity and honor. There were ceremonies, escorts, and military guards. And then, in 1930, many of those recovered polar bears were laid to rest around a monument in Troy, Michigan, an enduring symbol of sacrifice and brotherhood. It was not just burial. It was closure. It was the fulfillment of a promise. It was the nation acknowledging in a concrete way that the dead mattered, even when their war was forgotten. There is something uniquely American in that story. Not because America is the only nation that honors its fallen, but because this mission was not driven by victory parades or public pressure. It was driven by veterans, men who had already given years of their lives, who had already endured the Arctic, who could have chosen to forget and move on. Instead, they returned to the edge of the world to do what the world rarely asks of soldiers once the fighting ends, to take care of their own. That is the kind of loyalty that builds pride. That is the kind of story that deserves to be told in full voice, and it also reveals something darker and more human: how easy it is for history to forget. If the polar bears had not organized, if they had not pushed, those graves might have remained unknown forever. The men would have stayed in the snow, and their names would have faded into paperwork, reduced to missing, erased by time. Instead, because a few veterans refused to accept that outcome, those names returned. Those bodies returned. Those stories returned. And the polar bear expedition gained something it rarely receives in history: an ending defined not only by hardship and confusion, but by honor. So when we talk about the polar bear expedition, we shouldn't stop at the battles. We should talk about what came after. We should talk about what it means for a nation to face the aftermath of war and choose responsibility over convenience. Because this 1929 mission was not about politics. It was not about ideology. It was about a simple belief: an American soldier should not be abandoned in a foreign grave if there is any way to bring him home. In the frozen north, the polar bears fought because they were ordered to fight. But in 1929, they returned because they chose to return. And that choice, quiet, determined, heavy with emotion, is one of the strongest proofs of brotherhood and national honor you will ever find in American military history.